All right, hello everyone. Welcome to today's presentation and tasting with Dorado. We have Shaun, Caleb, Sharon, Sue-Hang, and your host Matt Petrick here to take you on a deep dive through the heritage stills of Demerara Distillers, and of course, a tasting of El Dorado single still rums, which I'm sure you're all looking forward to. Real quick, before we get into all of that, I'm Will Hookinga from Zavvy.co and just want to point out a few different ways that you can interact with everyone throughout the presentation today. So to your right, you'll see a chat window. Feel free to pop in anytime, tell us where you're watching from, say hello. I know we already have, I'm looking over here, we've got quite a few people in attendance from all over the world, so that's very cool to see. If you have a question at any point during the presentation, you'll want to enter that into the question box at the bottom. So you'll see a little button down there that says ask a question. Just hit that button, type in your question. Matt and I will be keeping an eye out for those throughout the presentation. Yeah, with all that said, Matt, I'm going to turn things over to you. Everyone, you probably know Matt Petrick from cocktailwonk.com. He's written quite a bit about this distillery, their history and their rum. So he's going to be your host today. And Matt, take it away and let everyone know what they're in for this afternoon.
Great. Well, thank you, Will. It's a pleasure to be back on here. We did quite a few of these last year with my work. Did quite a few of them, and it's been 7 or 8 months since we've done one. So it's great to be back on this platform. Like Will said, I am a rum writer, educator, historian, jack of all trades. I was incredibly lucky to be contacted by Demerara Distillers to come share the single still tasting with you, to host this. I myself visited the distillery at the end of 2019 and got to spend a lot of time with both Sharon Sue-Hang, who's Demerara Distillers El Dorado master blender and much more, as well as Shaun Caleb, the master distiller, and much more. So I consider them good friends. They've shared lots of great information with me, which I've included in material I've written, and I'm just incredibly excited to be doing this. So very briefly, why don't you just, if you could, just give us like a sentence or two about what you're doing at DDL, and then we'll jump into the presentation. So Sharon, you go.
Well, hello everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Sharon Sue-Hang, master blender for El Dorado rum. I've been with Demerara Distillers for the last 26 years.
Okay.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And Shaun?
Well, I've only been with El Dorado for half as long as Sharon. 13 eventful years, but 13 very rewarding years at the same time. Leonard, Shaun, Caleb, yes, I have 3 first names. You can take your pick. And I am here as master distiller, but also as a chief production officer for the company.
Right, and that's a lot of things. I understand, not just the rum, but much more for the company.
That's right. It's the rums, but also the chasers.
Yes, exactly. That's a good way to put it. And a little bit more about how this is going to flow today. First off, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Demerara Distillers. I've done a bit of historical research on it. I wanted to share that. And then Shaun's going to jump in and tell us all about the 3 wooden heritage stills, like in depth about them. And I know these are one of the favorite topics of rum geeks out there. And then when Shaun's done, we'll have some time for some questions, and then we're going to jump into the tasting part of the session with Sharon. And if you were like an invited guest to this presentation, you should have the little tasting packs with the 3 little samples of each rum. If you're watching on the Facebook live stream, you're not technically an invited guest per se, but we knew that there would be so much great information shared here that rather than just limiting it to like a small private tasting, we wanted to also just broadcast it on Facebook Live so that more of you could watch and enjoy and learn from them. So that's why it's structured like this. It's a little different from your typical presentation. So with that in mind, let's jump into the presentations here. Okay, so what I wanted to do is just give you a brief little bit of history of Demerara Distillers and El Dorado rum to help set the context for what Shaun and Sharon are going to share with you in a bit. So I promise I won't take too long. I know you want to hear them talk, but yeah, let's jump into the next slide. Well, okay, so Um, I love this. I love this map. It's an old map from 1759 in what was then Dutch Guyana. Essentially, like most of the Caribbean and parts of South America, the Caribbean was essentially colonized and used primarily for agricultural purposes like sugarcane growing and eventually rum. So this map here is a great example of showing you sort of where what the early Caribbean sugar estates and rum making, where it was located, and in Demerara, which is named after the Demerara River, you can see there. In Demerara, you can see basically each little box there represents a sugar estate. And if you look at the top, you see at the top part of the river there, if you look over to almost to the far right, you see estate number 10. If you look at the top of the picture there, it says 1753 John Carter Diamond. That is the Diamond Estate. So that is the estate where Demerara Distillers is still made today, or where El Dorado Rums and the Demerara Distiller Rums are still made today. So the estate goes back even further, but I think it's a great visual to show you how long the history, Demerara Distillers and the companies that comprised it, how far they go back. So next slide. So we're going to jump forward a couple hundred years here. This is an image from 1959. I found this in a government records book. The key thing about it is it's essentially showing you in 1959, 1960, that era, that what was once hundreds of different sugar estates with small distilleries associated with them had now basically consolidated down to just 8 distilleries. So by 1960, there were just 8 remaining operating rum distilleries in Guyana, or technically at the time it would have been British Guyana. And if you look at those names there over on the left, like Skeldon, Port Morant, Albion, Blairmont, Enmore, La Bonne Intention, Diamond, Versailles, and Iflut, you'll see, I think, it's 9 actually. You'll see that many of them are familiar to you. If you're a rum geek and maybe you've got some independently bottled rum and you maybe see like a Versailles, what they call, I guess they say Versailles still, rum, or a Skeldon rum, or an Albion, when you see these names in independent bottles, those are actually the names of some of these old historic distilleries, which are still operating as late as the 1960s. But consolidation would continue. So next slide, Will. In 1966, if I remember, in 1966, or 1962, 66, I believe, British Guyana became its own independent country. And like many countries in the Caribbean that essentially became their own, like many colonies in the Caribbean that became their own independent countries in the 1960s, 1970s, a wave of nationalization sort of swept through them, where basically things like the sugar industry and the rum industry basically came under government control. The most famous example being Cuba in 1960, but the same thing happened in Guyana in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Essentially, the government assumed control over the remaining sugar estates and rum distilleries. So by, I think it was around 1975 or so, they were down to basically 3 remaining rum companies, rum producing entities. So there was a Diamond Liquors Limited company, DLL. There was the Guyana Distillers Limited, which owned the Iflut Distillery, and then there was the Demerara Distilleries Limited, which owned the Enmore Distillery, which was a subsidiary of the GDL. That picture there, what you see on the right there, shows like 2 casks that are actually at Demerara Distillers today, and they sort of represent the 2, or sort of like the 2 remaining rum making entities that joined together, which formed what we know today as Demerara Distillers Limited, aka DDL. Basically, all these from hundreds of states down to 8, down to 3, down to one remaining rum making entity in 1983, which we know of as DDL. Next slide. An important date in DDL history was 1992 when they launched El Dorado 15. And today we sort of recognize this as a very sort of revered sort of canonical premium rum expression. But back in 1992, it was quite a big deal because it was one of the very, very first long-aged Caribbean rums that was made available. If you go back 20, 30 years, premium rum was nowhere near the thing it is today. That most rum distilleries were still focusing on bulk rum and or inexpensive, lightly aged rum. So El Dorado 15 in 1992 was sort of like what kicked off this sort of slow growth towards this huge variety of distillery released long aged Caribbean rum. So it's an important part of rum history as well as DDL history. Next slide. Now, remember earlier I mentioned that there were all these different distilleries and that just slowly consolidated. It turns out that the stills that were at the Diamond Distillery, which is what we're talking about today, those stills were at the Diamond Distillery. Those stills were there from the beginning, but most of the other stills from these other estates, like the Port Morant still, were actually had all sort of coalesced and were all living at the Iflot Distillery, which is, I'm thinking, around 30 or 40 miles, and Shaun can correct me, but 30 or 40 miles from the Diamond Estate. So if you go back, to 1999 or before, there was this huge collection of different heritage stills that are all living at the Iflot Distillery. But then in 1999, further consolidation had Iflot close, and all of those stills moved to what is now the Diamond Estate outside of or near Georgetown. So next slide. So with all these different stills there, and I think DDL has at least 10, if not 12 different stills, they can make a very wide range of rums. Sharon has told me there's at least 24 different marks, and when I visited DDL, she showed me all of them. This is an image of that. Like each glass represents a different mark that DDL makes, and from very light rum at almost 95% ABV to the very heavy Port Morant distillate. And from these different marks, the wide range of different El Dorado rums, as well as rums they make for their partners, can be made. And so it's Sharon's task to create all of these different rums from this very broad palette of different marks that the DDL produces. Next slide. And then this is sort of a quiz for me, and just as like initiate things. This is just some of the many different stills that are at Demerara Distillers there. So a little quiz for me is to make sure I can name them all correctly just from the image. So going from top left across and then from the bottom, that would be the Saval still. It's a four-column continuous still. The middle one is the Diamond Coffee still. I believe there are two of those there. To the right is the Diamond High Ester still, which is most people don't know about, but it's the only double retort pot still at Demerara Distillers that makes very high ester rum. Down bottom left, we have there's actually two stills there. There's the MPRS, which I believe is multi-pressure rectification system, and the Diamond Coffee 3. And those are basically two new stills that were introduced in around 2003, 2004. If I remember correctly, Shaun helped sort of bring them up and helped get them underway at DDL. To the right of that is their Versailles still, which most of us would say Versailles, but apparently it's pronounced Versailles in Guyana. Then the Enmore wooden coffee still, the tall red one there. And then last but not least, the Port Morant double wooden pot still. So there's a cornucopia of different stills, and there's more that I'm not even showing here, but there's a cornucopia of different stills that DDL has at their disposal. But it's the last three that are all made of wood, which are what we're going to focus on today. So next slide. Now Shaun is going to take over and tell us all about those last three stills.
Thank you very much, Matt. What a very crisp version of the history you've given there. It's often hard to condense so many centuries into a few slides.
Yeah.
I think you did an excellent job.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
If I may seg first with the history, but before I say that, so the newer stills were actually installed in 2010 into 2011, so a bit younger than that. So like Matt mentioned, we would have started distilling many, many moons ago. In fact, it would have been introduced first by the Dutch way back in the mid-17th century. The Dutch at the time had done a fantastic job at reclaiming a lot of the land from the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, to create the embankments of the Essequibo and Demerara coast mainly. And that is where most of the initial plantations were established. Of course, once those got going, then of course, sugar and distillation went hand in hand. One distillation was introduced in Guyana in 1670. I mentioned that because, the British at the time were already establishing themselves in many of the nearby Caribbean islands, in the whole British Caribbean. So seeing the Dutch having their way with all in this huge expanse of land are just so much more times bigger than any of the islands, even if you combine them, they became very interested. The Dutch, though, we know, were very good at setting up their forts to protect their installations. So that made it very difficult for the British to come in and sort of take over immediately. But what they did was to go to the east of Essequibo and Demerara, to the ancient county of Berbice. And there they were able to start setting up their earliest plantations, and with that, their earliest distilleries. So if you travel along the coast of the Berbice County, you might see names like Manchester and Liverpool. You might even be thinking you're in the English Premier League. But no, I suppose by virtue of the British having first established there, a lot of those small plantation villages took British names. For instance, the most famous of our stills, Port Morant, which was first installed at Plantation Port Morant, was actually named after the original British owner, Mr. Stephen Morant, who of course established a port at that particular village. And so it was named Port Morant after the owner, and this was in the early 1700s. And from there, the British worked their way westwards towards gaining more and more control of the territory. Sometime between 1780 and 1813, the British made significant progress in wresting a lot of control of the territory from the Dutch. And as they're able to do so, they're able to establish more plantations. By 1814, the British were more or less in control of the colony. And by 1831, we were officially British Guyana.
Yeah.
I'm saying all of this because
I will mention really quick. Like if you go back and look at the history of like the evolution of the British Caribbean and the rum making there, like we see Barbados very early, and then Jamaica, and in 1700s Jamaica was like the biggest British rum producer. And you're like, people were like, where's Guyana? And it really wasn't until around 1815 or so that you see like Guyana sort of come online, and then within 50 years was out producing Jamaica, but that wasn't until the mid 1800s. So.
That's right, and that was after the British had full control of the territory. So a lot of their industrialists were able to come in and own plantation and set up distilleries and so on. So you're right, it was in that era that distillation really took off, until at one stage there were over 300 plantations. But if we go to the next slide, where I talk a bit more about the three particular stills that we're going to focus on today, the three heritage stills that are made of wood, the double wooden pot still, single wooden pot still, and the wooden continuous still. Those various stills are very much reflective of the era in which they were installed. So the double wooden pot still was installed, like I said, in Berbice, which was one of the earliest that the British were able to establish to the east of the country, given that that was the land where they had access and could avoid the Dutch forts that would fight back against British invasion. By 1880, by that time, many things had changed. Of course, we were fully a British colony. Of course, column distillation was already discovered. And so newer installations at that time were not really following the pot still methodology, but were following the wooden column still methodology. It was more efficient. One could produce more on a continuous basis and not be restricted by the volumes of a batch in the pot still type of rums. So the very heritage is preserved across those different eras by us keeping our double wooden pot still, 1732, our single wooden pot still around 1810, and our double wooden column coffee still around 1880. But beyond the heritage, those stills also give us a very distinctive array of different rum profiles. Matt would have mentioned that he sampled 24 glasses, but I can tell you, not many would envy him in terms of the duty to work through all of those. But at the same time, I'm sure many would envy him for having survived through it all. Those three stills really reflect different styles of rum. And as I interact with consumers, I'm often energized to see when they're able to relate their own particular spirit preferences with something in the El Dorado family. I've heard, for instance, that some of our rums have particular cognac type notes, some have particular malt type notes, and other whiskey type notes. As we go through the presentations, I will talk a bit more about how the particular style of distillation lend to those particular characteristics. We'll start first with the double wooden pot still. As mentioned before, that was installed at Plantation Port Morant in 1732. At that time, I would reckon that most distillations in Guyana were by pot stills. This, however, was one of the longest, in fact, is the longest surviving ones, because today it is the only one that is still maintained in operation. We often get questions about, well, has that still really been maintained in its true form from 1732 onwards? Well, I can tell you, anyone having an up-close visual of those copper pipes can tell that they're well-worn and they're well-aged. But more importantly, they're still doing the job. And so, yes, from 1732 onwards, even after Port Morant would have closed and various consolidations would have taken place within the industry, those stills were moved to different plantations, ending up at Iflut. And when Iflut was closed in 1999, that's when it came across to Diamond. So from 1732 to 2021 and counting, almost 3 centuries of unbroken production. It's the only one of its kind today. I showed 2 photographs there at the bottom. The one to the right would have been captured prior to 2010. It's always difficult to get a good visual of the still that shows all of its components, only because at the point where Diamond became the sort of place to consolidate all of these stills, with limited land space available, it was difficult to fit everything together. But our engineers were hard at work to find ways of putting all of those stills on the same property, even if it meant that sometimes we don't quite get the bird's eye view of any particular one as we would like. The photograph to the left, I suppose those blue pipes you can blame me for. So the visual is perhaps even less clear, even less bird's eye now, because those pipes block the view from the north. Those pipes take cooling water to our newer distilleries. More importantly, though, regardless of whatever installations we have done on the property over the last 2 decades or so, those stills, the double wooden pot still, remains untouched. I'll talk now a bit more about how it operates, but first let me show you a model of the still. So yes, it's very difficult to get a good visual of all of the components. Luckily, we have in our visitor center a model of the double wooden pot still. So you can see there the 2 wooden vats. Each of them are connected by a copper gooseneck pipe that links the vapor from one pot to the next and from the second pot to the retort. So that vertical copper installation there in 2 parts The lower part is the retort, which receives the vapor from the second pot, and the above that is the rectifier, which receives the vapor from the retort. The rectifier essentially helps to polish the spirit before it finally gets condensed. So the pipe you see coming off of the vertical insulation that leads to the condenser, where the spirit is cooled and then taken to the spirit's case from which it flows to either the low wine spot or the particular spirit spot. But this gives you a sense of all of the components. The next slide, I try to give a brief schematic to give you a sense of operationally what the flow is. So the first pot drives the second pot. Essentially, there is direct injection of steam to boil the liquid. As the vapor is produced, it doesn't get away immediately just because the copper pipe helps to condense it. It falls back. However, when the temperature and pressure in the first pot is sufficient to allow for sufficient vapors to cut across into the second pot, at that point, the second pot now is heated and boiled by the first pot. This process of evaporation and condensation continues in the second pot until the vapor pressure in that second pot is enough for vapors to cut across into the retort. In the retort, there is a spike of low wines, which ensures that there is sufficient vapor to generate sufficient pressure to allow for the vapors to escape into the rectifier. If it's too low, essentially it will be condensed and fall back continuously. You won't get a distillate. So it is important to have some amount of spike so that you have enough pressure to survive the cooling in the rectifier. And then from there, the arrow at the top, it goes now to be condensed for collection.
Yeah. And I just want to point out really quick for people who are watching, this sort of looks like a traditional double retort pot still, but it's not. There's a critical difference. They look very similar, but there's a critical difference. And I think you're going to cover that in the next slide.
Yes, absolutely. That's a good seg. So this is one of our operators who has been with us for 35 years. We have many people, in as much as we have ancient stills, I wouldn't say we have ancient people, but we certainly have long-serving people who, because of what they do and the joy they bring to what they do, perhaps still look very young. Of course, my colleague Sharon is an example of that, who at 26 years of service perhaps doesn't look a year older than 26 years on earth. I don't know how she does it, but I digress. The heavy style rum that comes from the double wooden pot still is essentially a double batch distillation. Matt is correct that it's not a double retort system, it's a double distillation system, in that essentially 3,000 gallons of fermented beer is filled into the first pot and 2,000 gallons into the second pot. So the first pot has the advantage because it is taken all the way to boiling point, and it has slightly bigger volume so as to generate slightly more vapors, because the intention of those vapors is to heat and drive the second pot. Once the vapors are able to cut across from the first into the second, of course, those vapors do the same to the second, they heat it up. As mentioned before, there are always going to be vapors that escape all throughout the process, but we don't want the vapors to cut across too early. We want those vapors to be rich in alcohol and in the essential components. So the copper pipes that connect the two help to condense the vapor until there is sufficient vapor pressure that the vapor can essentially survive that condensation and still have vapors going across into the next stage. Because of the double pot system, as opposed to a double retort system, a key difference is that the heating of the second pot is less aggressive. See, if this were a double retort system, after the first retort, the vapors coming across would be a lot richer because of the spike in that retort. And therefore, the second pot would be driven a lot faster. In our case, there isn't a retort between the two pots. It's one pot directly into the other, which means that, yes, the second pot has to be patient, and it has to wait for the pressure in that first pot to slowly build and reach sufficiency that it can then generate vapors to go across. And even when it does, that second pot still has to now heat up and reach the required pressure before vapors are able to cut across. So the process, therefore, is a lot more elongated. It's a lot slower, a lot longer, and it allows for the pressures to actually reach much higher values in line with the higher temperatures. What this does, the higher temperature and higher pressure allows for more of the heavier components to actually survive across into the final distillate, as opposed to if it were a double retard system. Because at a higher pressure, beyond the lighter heads and the, of course, ethanol, a lot of the heavier components are then able to also distill across at the same time. This, in effect, enriches the composition of the heavier alcohols in the vapors, and therefore the rum overall becomes a lot more heavy, much more heavier in profile. We can go to the next slide. So the diagram below gives you, again, a repeat of the same process with the two pots. I want to talk now a bit about the role of the retort and the rectifier. So the retort is made of copper. And so copper, we know, is very important for distillation. It helps to react out some of the sulfurous and malodorous compounds out of the distillate. It also allows for contact of the acids and alcohols in the vapors on the copper surface to react to produce esters. Now, esters are those compounds that are very flavorful. Every fruit and flower owes its aromas to an ester, and so you therefore can imagine that the presence of copper helps to produce a lot more of those esters in the finished product, certainly compared to any other stills. I can tell you that as a final product, these stills are able to produce 2 to 5 times more esters in the final product than would be produced on any continuous still, just because of the long contact time of the vapor with copper, because of the style of distillation. Now the retort is spiked with some amount of low wines from previous batches, and this is just to ensure that there is enough volatile alcohol present, so that once the vapor cuts across and heats it up, there is sufficient vapor that the pressure is sufficient to survive the cooling in the rectifier. Apart from that, one might find that the vapors would simply not reach enough pressure and always fall back, which is obviously counterproductive. So the spike is very important in ensuring that essentially that there's always enough vapor to come across. Once it gets through the rectifier, the rectifier is basically like a condenser, except it's a condenser in reverse, in that it has copper tubes inside a shell. The vapors pass through the copper tubes, and the water passes outside the copper tubes within the shell. The water, of course, helps to cool the vapors, and so initially it would fall back, but over time, once the pressure is sufficient, it's able to cut across into the condenser. And so at that stage, we have our final distillate. Of course, the first portion is taken off as a heads cut, then we have the hearts, and then once the alcohol strength drops too low, we then cut across to the tails. The heads and tails are taken as low wines for subsequent batches, and of course the hearts goes to our spirits receiver as the main product. Next. So the photograph at the bottom shows these were distilled, I believe it was in 2010, and taken out. They were sampled after a few years. So you can see already the rich development of color. So those final vapors that are polished, fully polished in the rectifier, so lots of esters, not much of the sulfurs, because those would have been pulled out already with all of the copper contact. So the heavier product that is then produced, of course, is now complex. Complex because, well, first of all, it does have a significant presence of esters, but also a lot of the heavier alcohols are able to be distilled over. So in the product, there's a wide composition of densities, ranging from light components all the way to the heavier components. Those heavier components tend to give the woody, leathery profile that the PM rum is very noticed for, as well as, of course, the fruity and sweet aromatic notes that come from the esters and the lighter components. Of course, they all meld very well together to give that very complex, heavy-bodied rum that we all come to know. So like Matt said for Sharon, this rum produces, as I say, the perfect canvas, because once they are matured, then the heavier components produce heavier components still because of all the different aging reactions that take place. But also the lighter components are also able to react to polymerize and form other components. So overall, the density and weight and viscosity of the rum just increases significantly over time during the aging process. And like I mentioned in that glass below, after just, I believe it was 4 years, you can see the significant development of color already.
Hey, Shaun, quick question. What is the typical ester level of distillate coming off the Port Morant?
Minimum 50 grams per hectoliter.
Okay. But it's not, not 300, 500 like you see in the Jamaican distillers.
Right. Well, to do that, you would have to purposely spike the ester content at the stage of fermentation.
Right.
I should mention that for all of the stills we're talking about today, in fact, for all of our continuous stills, so that would include the metal stills, the coffee, the savals, the newer stills, all of those stills receive the same wash. There's no difference.
Right.
All right.
So other than the DHE, nothing is fermenting for 2 weeks, for example.
That's right. The same fermented wash, 24 to 28, 32 at most hours of fermentation, ready to be distilled. And so the fact that we can achieve, 2 times, like I said, as many as 5 times in the case of a lighter rum, is just testimony to the elongation of the distillation process, which allows for more of those components to be formed through copper contact.
I just wanted to mention really quick, Shaun mentioned the woody, leathery notes. Those notes are sort of, from my perspective, those are like the canonical notes that make up British Navy rum, like the Royal Navy rum, like that Port Morant component to Royal Navy rum. It's just like, if it's not in there, it's not Royal Navy rum to me. Like strongly associated with it. In fact, I even have purchase records from the 1940s that show the Royal Navy purchasing Port Morant rum specifically.
That's right.
Yeah.
So if we can seg from the malty Navy style rums to a more cognac-y style rum, and it's interesting that the rum that we have in our portfolio that has those cognac type notes is in fact a rum that comes from an estate that was originally French owned. No surprise there, right? So they obviously brought their nuance to the spirits of their homeland to the style of distillate. In particular, they would have used a single wooden pot still, which was first installed in the early 1800s. You are correct, Matt. We say Versailles in Guyana. So forgive me if I say Versailles during the presentation. We are authentic to our Guyanese lingo. And so that estate is actually an amalgamation in its latest form. So we talked a bit about the era when many estates consolidated, mostly after the introduction of sugar taxes and so on in the European continent. And so that happened throughout the coast of Guyana. In this particular case, these are small estates. So Schoonard and Good Fortune estates, they were amalgamated to form SXG. And later on, those 2 estates amalgamated with Versailles to form VSG. So Versailles, Schoonard, Good Fortune. And that plantation survived all the way until the early 1970s, when the pot was then moved and eventually found its way to diamond like the others. Next. So I'll give you a brief about the production of the single wooden pot still. It's a very similar principle to the double wooden pot still, except of course there's only a single pot and therefore a single batch. In the case of the Versailles, one key difference is that the retort is not spiked with low wines, all right, as the double wooden pot still, which has an influence on the overall composition. There aren't nearly as much of the heavier components present in the single wooden pot still as there is in the double wooden pot still. Overall, the rum is still fairly heavy-bodied, like I said, with slightly lower, heavier alcohols, and also slightly lower esters, which makes sense because it has not been in contact with copper for as long or as much as in the double wooden pot still, which has two copper swan necks connecting the two pipes. As a result, the flavors in the rum are of sufficient density, weight, viscosity to give a heavy-bodied feel, but not quite as pronounced as a double wooden pot still. The notes that come here tend to be more, as I described, sweet and savory type cognac notes. So nutty, chocolatey, coffee, salted toffee, notes along those lines. If I move finally to the wooden coffee still, as I mentioned earlier, by this time we were fully British owned, and by this time also in 1830, the wooden coffee still was invented. So most distilleries began to move away from the batch distillation process towards the column distillation for reasons of efficiency, maintenance, and volume. And like Matt mentioned too, this also coincided with the era when, although there were fewer distilleries, they were consolidated, hence larger, and they also produced a lot more product, now beginning to rival Jamaica. In this particular instance, the wooden coffee still was installed at Enmore on the east coast of Demerara, and it was based off of the original patent. Today, it remains the only one of its kind in operation. And I've shown on the left a photograph of the last time this still was touched. Maintenance work was done in the early 2000s. And so the bright red paint, I mean, you have to nice it up after you've done maintenance, right? So that is why it is so brightly red. But on the right is the model of the double wooden column still. On the next slide, I'll walk through the process a bit. So you see the two columns there. One column essentially receives the fermented wash, strips the alcohol, and the vapor from the evaporation then goes into the second pot to be refined in the rectifier. Now, the alcohol, the fermented beer, is preheated by passing it through coils in the rectifier. Of course, the rectifier has vapors rising up it. And so those vapors are able to heat or to preheat the wash in the coils. And then once the wash comes out of the rectifier, it is then fed to the first column to be stripped. There is direct feed of steam to the first column to strip the alcohol from the wash. And so in this way, it operates pretty much like any other column still, where the alcohol is stripped using steam, and then the vapor that is emitted from that steam vaporization then goes to the second column for refining. In the wooden coffee stills, although it's made of wood, its structure is entirely wood, the top, the bottom, the sides. Internally, there are copper sieve plates that are sandwiched between the wooden slabs at each layer. And so that copper helps to provide the surface that's important for enhancing the ester content. Again, remember that esters are formed on the surface of copper when the alcohol reacts with acids that are coming in the fermented wash. It also helps to remove a lot of the malodorous, sulfurous compounds and so on. And so overall, it becomes a much more flavorful spirit. Unlike the double wooden pot still, or even the second, the single wooden pot still, the distillation in this case is a lot shorter. It takes about 2 hours to get product through, as opposed to the double wooden pot still, which can take 16 hours, and the single wooden pot still, which can take about 12 hours. So it doesn't have quite as much time to develop quite as big of a body, but it certainly develops a significant, what we call a medium-bodied profile, just because of the significant presence of copper, which really helps to enhance those flavorful components. Yes?
Okay. Quick question. So this still is square in design. So I assume the plates inside of it are square rather than round, like a traditional coffee.
That's right.
Okay. And are they a challenge to clean? Like I assume it's a real pain to sort of take this apart and clean it. What is that like?
Yes. Well, we actually don't take it apart to clean it. We just pass. So first of all, the runs of this are very short. I cannot tell you whether it has always been that way, but certainly in the modern era, those runs are short, and that enables us to, in between runs, to pass water and steam to essentially flush the system out before the scales get a chance to harden.
Okay.
So in that way, it has not posed significant challenge to keep the column clean.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I remember looking at talking with Daryl about the diamond coffee and how like you'd get like this much scale build up like in a week or two. So I was wondering how do you keep that from happening there?
Right. Well, actually, it depends on the still. So we have, like you mentioned, two operating coffee stills on the property, two of the heritage coffee stills, metal coffee stills, that is. In one case, we return the low wines from the rectifier to the analyzer, the stripping column, that first column. And as we know, the presence of those fusel oils help to accentuate the scaling out. And so that particular scale still scales up very, very quickly. 6 or 7 days, you have to stop to clean. However, on the other coffee still, where we don't do that, it's once in, once out, and we collect all of the low wines separately in storage. In that case, because the low wines are not fed back to the stripping column, the scaling process is not nearly as aggressive. And so we can run that column for a month without having to stop to clean.
Interesting. And how many plates are in each of the Enmore columns?
I believe the analyzer has about 26 and there are about 42 or so in the rectifier.
Okay.
But those numbers, I can confirm those for you.
Okay, close enough.
Yes. I have to sometimes remind myself I'm getting a bit more grays, so sometimes the memory.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
All right. So, yes.
I was going to say, you haven't had to replace, or when was the last time you had to replace any part of the wood in the Enmore?
Like I said, I believe it was 2004, so very early in the 2000s. And so that was the first photograph I showed with the freshly painted red.
Okay. Okay. So it lasts a long time. You're not having to do this every 2 or 3 years.
Well, this is the beauty of being in the tropics. Because we have so much access to green heart, which is well regulated, but we don't require much of it. Green heart is the hardest known wood species. It's legendary for marine applications, for building homes, and we still have to this day Victorian homes in Georgetown, our capital city, that are still standing and well maintained. Of course, it's always heart-rending to see some of those homes being replaced by concrete structures, but we wouldn't attack the owners for that. But there are many still that are still standing and well maintained, built of green heart, dating all the way back to those years. Right. So green heart is very well known as a hardwood for these kinds of applications.
Yeah, and my understanding is that it's great in marine applications, and as long as you keep it wet, it doesn't degrade. It's only when you sort of go through wet, dry cycles that it starts to decompose, which is one reason I think why your Port Morant still has keeps water on top of it during distillation.
That's right. So the wood has a very fine texture, and it's very uniform, and the grains are very compact. So as long as you keep it either wet or dry, it maintains that very close-knit structure. Wet dry would cause the structures, the grains to start moving apart. So that's no good.
Okay.
All right. So yes, before I pass it over to my colleague Sharon, I know by now you guys are very, very eager to get into the tasting. But I wanted to say a bit more about our use of caramel, which has been an historical process for us. I have consulted, for example, the blue books, which would show the export of rums year by year by a state. And they do show that a century ago even, there was significant export of caramel-colored rums. In fact, some of those supplies continue to this very day. So we have bulk customers who would ask for certain rums colored and some not colored, and that is all traditional.
And that's
Um,
going to be like a state-made caramel, not E150.
that's right. It's our own in-house caramel. I am probably going to get into trouble for saying this, but I do know that some of our partners who may use the E151 and so on, E150, sorry, would when they taste our caramel, would say, "Wow, this is splendid. Can we have some of what you guys have to use in our product?" We've had that experience. It is certainly very distinctive. Um, I wouldn't say that it is a process that was driven by science in the early days, but I can tell you that we have certainly brought the science up to date to understand why the caramel has those particular components. And to the extent that it's a matter of preserving legacy, and to the extent that it's a matter of maintaining the specific character of the colored rums, we have kept it as part of our production style. What has changed, however, and this really started from 2004. So, our chairman of the company then and now have both been visionary men, and they have recognized that El Dorado, especially given the traction that started in the late 1990s, once we started to win those gold medals at the International Wine and Spirits and other competitions, they recognized the potential for this rum to really, really grow, and therefore the need for expanded warehousing facility. What that did for us was to give us the ability to move away from that heavy reliance on caramel towards aging in what we call fresh wood, ex-bourbon barrels that are freshly procured. The process was gradual, um, but over a period of years, we've been able to assess that the character of the rum, whether aged in ex-bourbon barrels, more significantly, with less and less recycling of those barrels within the system, as opposed to aging with caramel and aging by recycling the barrels more and more, as was done in the past. We have found that there isn't a significant difference in profile in the finished product. And so over the years, we've continued to expand the number of warehouse facilities that we've had, and also expand with that the number of barrels that receive uncolored liquid. And so a lot of the El Dorado rums now that are sold of very recent production would actually have very little or none of caramel colored rums. We still have some caramel colored rums in our inventory, but not nearly as much as a percentage of our stock holding as we did in the past. I mentioned this because concomitant with the use of caramel, we have found that the level of residual sugars produced during the aging process did tend to be higher. By now, relying more on rums that are aged without caramel, we are seeing the fruit of that, in that the rum is just as delicious, but it has much less residual sugars. And it makes the point that fine rums with profile and character and personality, doesn't need to rely on anything inauthentic to continue that profile.
Right. And I think that it's an important point that you mentioned to me, that it wasn't every single mark or every single sort of distillery you were replicating. It wasn't every single barrel that was aged with caramel. It was like certain expressions or certain marks. Is that a true statement?
That's a very true statement. So even among the three rums that we're going to talk about today, there are some port morans that were aged, but most of it was not. And more, by and large, was not, but there was a few. And again, this was dependent on customers that was. Versailles, on the other hand, was predominantly aged with caramel. And so, for example, in our system, we have VSG or SXG, depending on which customer and when they started to buy, but those two are the same, essentially. But then there's a colored variant REV. And so that is very much something that is that we are noted for. And so for the most part, Versailles would have been aged with caramel, whereas for the other two, for the most part, they would not have been aged with caramel. Of course, for El Dorado, we have been moving towards standardizing the practices. But again, Historically, we were a bulk supplier and we sold what the customers wanted. And so therein lies the history of which rums were aged with caramel and which rums were not.
Right, and I think it's an important point as well to realize is even if you started sort of moving away from aging with caramel in 2005, say, if you're going to use some in a 15-year rum, it's going to take 15 years for that to sort of go through the system. So it's not like you can start doing it and your rums that you're releasing that year are going to be influenced by what you're doing. Everything is very long pipeline, and I think sometimes people forget that.
Yes. But what I can say to you is this. So when I first interacted with the company in 2003, I know I said 13 years, but I have a 4 years prior to that. And truth be told, I'm 13 and 3/4. So when you get to 15 in this company, we start calling you an adult. Below 15, you count months and years. But I digress.
Yeah.
So at that point, from that point to now, we have tripled the amount of barrels we have in holding. We have added, just in the time that I have joined the company, we have moved from having 2 warehouses to now having 5. And I can tell you in another few years, that will be expanded further still by another 2. So we have been growing and therefore have been meeting the capacity, but in an organic way.
Right, and you actually age in 2 different locations. You have the Diamond Distillery as well as the iFlot Distillery. That the iFlot Distillery is sort of not there anymore, but the aging warehouses remain, and that's I was very lucky to visit them with you and sample some of very old rums from that warehouse.
That's right.
Right.
Well, we know how temptation can be, right? So we try to keep the older rums away from the eyes of those who may be tempted.
Right. Yes, good idea. So, well, great. Thank you for covering this. And I just wanted to jump in really quick here. Shaun had graciously answered a ton of my questions and some other questions that I'd asked about online. I sort of took Shaun's answers to a bunch of very geeky questions about the 3 single stills, and I wrote them up in a post on my website there. I think Will is going to insert a URL to it, which is there on the screen, but Will will insert the URL into the chat. So if you want to go even deeper than what Shaun has here, there's the most recent post on my website has Shaun telling even more about these stills. So next slide. So I'm just let me look through the questions really quick and see if there's anything we want to ask in the short term. I think just one question I want to ask before we jump to Sharon. It says, it's from, I can't see here. It says, are the stills that were at Albion, Skeldon, and others, are they still surviving in Diamond? And if not, what distinguishes the rum made there so that they can be recreated on the other stills? I'm thinking of the recent Albion 2004, Skeldon 2000, etc. Like I said, I know there's the marks like the Albion and the Skeldon of those. Now I think they're made on the Saval still. But can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I know we didn't talk about the Saval still today. That is actually the workhorse, because that one still can make over 9 different rums, light all the way to medium body with a variety of profiles. So during the consolidation process, when many of those estates were closed, I know that the task was to try to replicate the rums of that still on an existing still. If that were not possible, well, then the still would have to move. In the case of Albion and Skeldon and Blairmont, those marks were able to be replicated on the Saval still. And so there was therefore no need to retain too many of the same stills. So in fact, we have 2 of the Saval stills still in operation. So we have kept 2, but beyond 2, the others were demolished. This is as opposed to, for example, the EHP wooden coffee still, which was not so easily replicated, and so that still was kept. Ditto for the PM double wooden pot still. Of course, the pot still can only come from a double pot. So that was replicated, even though distillation had moved on in terms of technology to column stills and from wood to metal and the various designs, the number of columns, etc. In spite of all of that, because those stills were not able to replicate the double wooden pot still, that was retained. But to answer your question, because the Skeldon, Albion, Blairmont were able to be replicated on the Franceval stills, a small number of those were retained, and the rest of them were decommissioned.
Okay. So we're going to hold on. There's some other questions. We're going to hold on to them for the end. So let's now give Sharon the chance to have us drink some amazing rum.
Okay, well, Sharon is here again. After listening to the geeky stuff, now it's for the exciting part of the whole afternoon. So I'm sure you have your kit. So I'll go through. You can open it now. And
which one are we opening?
Yes. Oh, sorry, the Enmore. I like to start with the Enmore.
Okay.
And I'll move my way to the Versailles and then the Portmore.
Okay.
So we start with the Enmore. So you can throw out about 25 mil. Let's say about half of the amount you want. You know, Shaun would have explained the entire still and the profiles. So when I like to do the organoleptics or the sensory, of course, you watch the glass. I work with a 5S approach, where you see the product, you swirl it, then you smell, you sip, and you savor at the end. So we'll go through that process. When you throw it out, you would recognize the smell, the odor. And what are you getting? I know this is sort of a virtual session, so
right.
I have to.
Yeah, it's hard. Like you're not getting normal feedback you would. Yeah.
Yes, no feedback. Right. Yeah. But all the notes that were from the still in the esters, this is what I refer to as a medium body rum. You have a lot of fruity notes, estery notes. Are you getting like a butterscotch note? And like dark toffee? Yes. And then there's some like roasted coconuts. Are you getting those notes?
Yes.
I don't usually get as much coconut as other people do, so but I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, I get that hint of that, and some big apple, big peach sort of note, but a lot of dried tropical fruit notes definitely. You get in a hint of a smoky note, oaky note too.
Yes.
Yeah, that for sure.
And
yeah.
then we can now sip. How is that taste? Again,
yeah,
is the notes from the sensory. You're picking it up to.
Yeah.
Dry tropical fruit.
Yeah, it is similar to other Enmores I've had before. So yes.
Yes. Very fruity flavor. Excellent mouthfeel.
And what is the age on this, by the way? Like how long is it?
12 years old.
12 years. Okay.
Actually, all the 3 single stills are 12 years old.
Okay. Was that an intentional choice to go all with 12 of each of them?
Yes.
Okay. So in theory, we could almost recreate our own El Dorado 12 with these.
No. It's not as simple as that.
I would like to. Okay.
Yes.
We could make our own custom El Dorado 12 with these.
Yes. So, and very smooth finish. You know, it's really good to savor. I like how that feels on the palate.
Yeah. Somebody commented, said dried fruit is definitely there, almost apricot.
Yes.
And then somebody else says very fruity and lots of toffee.
Yes. And you could pick that up. I mean, normally the connection, with people and the flavor and the flavor chemistry,
right.
If you tell them this, yes, I can find that,
Right.
So it's really,
right.
It's all there, actually.
Right, yeah. And Chris from DC says it almost tastes like Armagnac. And somebody else says dried fruit oaky.
That's right.
Yes.
You know what I find is that if you kind of get a sharp whiff of the glass head on, that's when you get a lot of those more volatile notes. So like the peach, a little more of the fruit. But if you follow the legs and you kind of angle the glass so your nose kind of goes directly what is coming off as those legs form, then you get a bit more of the sweeter, aromatic, but slightly heavier type notes, like the butterscotch, the coconut. So you kind of have to strain the mind or trick the mind to kind of see past the more volatile ones,
Right.
kind of focusing on those that will only come after, sort of it as a second wave.
Right.
And so you see layer upon layer of those notes developing.
Yeah.
So the oak Sharon mentioned, oh yes, it really,
Yeah, it's right
it's
there. Yeah.
it really comes through, but with a bit of the cane, almost like a good burgundy.
Right. And this one was not aged with any caramel.
No,
No.
this one was not.
Okay. Yeah. Somebody said very round, perceived sweetness, even if it's not actually sugary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
And-
well, sorry. I'm excited because I always like to point out that there's a sensation of sweetness. Anything that is delicious has that umami factor. You are going to get that sensation, which is a very different feel from sugary sweet. So this is the authentic stuff.
Right. And somebody says, great tasting tip, Shaun. I think
Yeah.
was the tilting your nose, tilting the glass.
I could actually find all the flavors, but Shaun tip is great too. If you got the volatiles in front and then deeper down.
Yeah.
But
I
I like
guess
all the flavors.
Sharon is the expert, so for her, this is second nature. I have to cheat.
Yes. It's like I could find all these flavors. People sometimes wonder, where did you get that from?
This is what you do most of the time.
Yes, that's true.
And not just for El Dorado, but also sometimes for other, for your partner brands as well.
Yes. Okay, so we can move on to the Versailles. You could do the same, and if you have leftovers, it's good to keep that so we can maybe at the end do that comparison. Again, as they said, your eyes is your first nose in sensory evaluation. So you want to look at something appealing. And go back to what Shaun would have said with the notes that was coming out. And you find that it's like chocolatey. You get that on the front. So sort of slight leathery.
Okay.
So those are the kind of notes. Still estery, aromatic, that note you're getting to.
Yeah, I get that when you call leathery, to me, I associate with almost like a green vine or something like that, like a fresh cut green vine. And it's sort of same note that I get in the Port Morant, just a little more subtle here.
Yeah, slight peaty sort of note.
Yeah, like not chlorophyll, but something I'm picturing in a jungle, like there's a big green vine.
You're like swinging like Tarzan.
Yeah.
Yes. So we can have a taste now. So some of the same notes you're finding here. The chocolatey, the hint of that peaty note, slight licorice, oaky, very mellow. Are you? Yeah, I'm sure.
Yes, Chris. Yes, Chris says about this. He says, so much tropical fruit on the verge of being spoiled. Overripe papaya.
Overripe papaya.
I can kind of see it.
Yes.
Now he says, it's suggestion, but I can
I get
papaya. I get papaya there.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of that fruity odor, but a little bit of that leathery, chocolatey,
right? Yeah,
peat note still there.
Yeah. Ed from Indianapolis says like a fruit market in a hot, humid climate.
Yes.
Yeah. And then somebody else, or Paul Taylor says cooked fruit, almost fig and raisin-like.
Sort of like the dry tropical fruits, yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, so the estery, this is a heavy set rum, a heavy type rum. So you find all the flavors are there.
Yeah. So,
And
so
they
Shaun,
mellow out nicely with the aging.
or actually Sharon, these sort of leathery, heavy, oily notes, if you will. What is those? Aren't esters, like those are something else. Like what are those? What are
Some of
chemical?
about the higher alcohols, you have
Okay.
the isobutane, the
Okay.
isoamyl, the fusel oils.
Okay. Any particular fusel oils that are these notes?
Sort of like, yeah, the active amyl alcohols. You can
Okay.
find that.
Okay.
It
And I
tends to
think
be,
Shaun mentioned that in his Q&A, but go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say it's sort of like a synergy between the different notes. So because of all of the heavier alcohols, there tends to be also a fair presence of the heavier esters.
Mhm.
And so those tend to contribute as well, the coffee type notes, for example. Remember too that it is wood aged. So there's a significant extraction of a lot of
Trainable.
the oaky tannins and so on components, which in synergy with the fruity components and also the sweet aromatic components sometimes get expressed as that balance between dark and sweet.
Right, and it's interesting. I love talking about the higher alcohols because there's a certain group of people who love to talk, fixate on esters, Jamaican and higher ester levels and heavy, and so much of what we love about rums, and especially like the Versailles and Port Morant, is like there's a good amount of esters, but there's actually much more as these other more interesting things, the higher alcohols that give us these sort of unique flavors.
Right, right. While Sharon is having a final sip,
Mhm.
one of the things we talk about too is even the water. We have our own artesian wells on property, um, and there's a high water table, close proximity to the river, Demerara River, but also to the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
So there tends to be a very high minerality, and certainly as you taste this, beyond all of the notes that developed with entry and mid palate, to me, there's almost like a bit of smoke that survives with a very distinctive minerality. Like you get that salt traveling all the way to the back and along the sides of the tongue. And that is just testament to the very, thumbprint of the water quality that we use in our process. It helps to bring out a lot of these components a lot more. So as a product, we essentially offer the total profile by the very nature of all of the aspects of our ingredients.
Right. And actually, that's a good point as well. You're talking about the Demerara water. Can you just sort of briefly tell us about, like the Demerara sugar and like how that influences the Demerara rum, like how the water influences the sugar and the resulting molasses?
Well, the sugars do tend to be fairly rich because of the nature of the soil, rich in organic components and also in some of the inorganic nutrients. So, for example, phosphorus is a lot higher and so on, which I guess impacts the yeast fermentation. With our molasses, we don't need to essentially have as much nutrient addition for it to be very productive, as opposed to say molasses from drier soils, which don't offer as much. So a lot of the flavor development is a function of the very aggressive fermentation, both by yeast as well as bacteria, to produce a lot more compounds, over 200 in some cases.
Wow. Yeah, I'm like, I don't want to move on. I love this.
Yes. But how are you going to get
I
a
don't
double
wanna
wooden
move
pot
on.
still, right?
Yeah.
Yes, yes,
We have
yes.
the Port
So
Morant.
we are at the Port Morant. I'll do the tasting first, and then, but this is my favorite go-to. We'll do the same. Throw it out. Pour about 25 milliliter. Again, with the double pot, Shaun will have explained that. The flavors are really, really robust here. It's like all the volatiles rush in. Again, you find that sort of baked apple, vanilla notes, hint of some citrus and cinnamon. You have a banana, sort of a flambe banana note here. Are you getting that? The nice estuaries, of course, some peaty notes here.
Yeah.
Sort of like a tobacco
Yeah.
cigar.
Yeah.
type of note.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a multi-layered expression of different
Very
fruits
much so.
and sweet notes. I love that.
Mhm.
Yes. And then we could take a sip.
I already did. I couldn't hold off.
And you could pick the same sort of notes that you will smell on the taste also.
Yeah, like I said, for me, it's like the Versailles on steroids. Like I loved it. Like I loved it, and like a few of my friends don't love this, and I'm like, I don't get it. I just love like Port Morant is like. I think there's a few people in the comments who are like, "This is my favorite still," and I remember, when I visited the distillery, and like the high, like I was just anticipating the highlight of the day was seeing the Port Morant because it's such my favorite, my favorite still. And the funny thing is that like I almost tripped over it before, without realizing it. And I was like, I was in the column still section, and I saw the Enmore, and I had to go down to like, oh, that's it right there. And it was sort of like this is a moment I've been waiting for years to finally see this thing in the flesh, and I just love this particular expression from it so
Yes,
much.
Yeah, it's really excitement when you stand there and you see all the stills next to you.
Yeah, like literally, it's that one spot sort of coming down where like you can literally see every single still in there.
Oh, yes.
Or, not the MPRS outside, but
Yes, it's
even
up the palate. I love that about this rum.
Yes.
The Port Morant.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's always full bodied.
Right. Yeah.
So
All the notes that you could smell, you could pick that up. The cigar notes, peaty notes, of course, the estuary notes, banana, peach, apple,
So interesting question that just came to mind is, Shaun, you were talking about how the fermentations are the same for all the stills now, like not counting the DHE, but was that the same protocol when it was in IFLOT? I know it was a little before your time, but was the same idea in IFLOT, just one fermentation for everything?
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So it was, yeah. So it shouldn't have changed. Like the flavor profile wouldn't have necessarily changed. I'm just curious to go, like, if we went back, like if today's Port Morant from the 1940s, like, would it be identical, or how might it be different?
Well, Sharon is our standard bearer, so I can tell you we don't get past that very easily.
Yeah.
So the reference standards, you can tell us a bit
I'm
about
very
that.
strict in maintaining that.
Yeah.
So I'm very privileged to be the master blender here because, all the hard work that the master distiller is doing, that's what we get to enjoy at the end of the day.
Right.
And
Yeah.
team,
If you have any remaining now in your glass, you can do a comparison. If you start with the Enmore, and then you can do the Port Morant. And again, distinctly different notes, all made from the still. So the floral, the estuary, all the dry fruits here, whereas this is more peat cigar,
Right.
again mixed in with the estuary notes. And then you could do that for the Versailles, which is my second glass. This is, of course, more robust, and the Port Morant versus the Versailles. If you have any, you could drink up. And then we wouldn't do any work for the rest of the afternoon.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one thing people may not realize. Your job, Sharon, is as much as we, as us rum geeks, would love to think that you sort of wander amongst the cab and pull samples out and sample them all day. So much of what you're doing is actually planning planning like how much of each distillate and do we need to make El Dorado 15 in 20 years from now. But there's a substantial amount of logistics that go into creating El Dorado 3, 5, 8, 12, 15, 21. And I assume you have some sort of massive spreadsheet that helps you figure out like we need 30,000 cask of this and 20,000 cask of this. It's hard work. I can only imagine how much hard work it is, like doing what you're doing to sort of ensure that you have the rums that El Dorado wants to sell 10, 15, 20 years out.
Yes. And as you're right, yes, we do have some massive spreadsheets, but we manage, we project 25 to 30 years from now, and we try to make sure that all that has to be set down is set down. So that's why I keep the master distiller on his toes all the time too.
That's right.
Right.
The two warehouses I talked about that we are now about to embark on, those aren't for current needs. This is based strictly on our updated projection 2021. So it's very live and looking, as Sharon said, so many decades into the future. What will we need and what are our requirements? And we start now and putting the infrastructure in place, right, so that we then fill the capacity as required.
Right.
So, of course, that means many more lines on the spreadsheet, but I guess that's the price you pay for good stuff.
Right. Exactly. So anything else you want to share on the tasting notes or the tasting, Sharon?
Well, no, I just wanted the viewers to understand that these rums are unique and the float profiles based on the distillation is unique. Each one of them, they had an opportunity to taste and they would have maybe garnered their own flavor notes also, because flavor notes, I think as a sensory person, it's sometimes a personal thing too, where I could relate to a note that somebody else might not be able to relate to.
Right. Good.
But those are the main ones, and they're distinctly different. And, there's one for every person, actually. My personal favorite, of course, is Portland Rocks.
Right. Yeah, same here. As if you didn't know. But yeah, like you're part of what Shaun and Sharon do every day is make sure we have the particular distillates from the particular stills and that they're put in the correct barrels and in the right quantities to make El Dorado again 5, 10, 20 years into the future. So we appreciate your effort in this regard. So Will, next slide, or is there another slide? Next. All right, so we happen to have a little bit of time for extra questions here. So I'm going to switch over here and look at the questions. And yes, okay. So most popular question thus far, and like one question I've had as well. And it says, are there any plans to bring rum stronger than 40% to the U.S. market? I'm sure you've heard it lots of times, and I know that in Europe, for example, there were some single still releases that were at a higher strength. So, what can you tell us about this?
I will certainly pressure her to bring some releases. Let's put it that way.
Maybe you have to listen to the consumers, and as Shaun said, at that right time, of course, we'll make that decision.
Right. Yeah. No, it's I don't expect you to reveal any secrets or necessarily, but I think it's mostly enthusiasts going like, we love this. Now give us higher strength. So.
All right.
Okay. Next one. A question for Shaun from Ruben. It says, do the different marks produced on the Saval still vary in difficulty to make? For example, is SWR or AN more difficult to produce than ICPU, for example?
Yes, they vary in difficulty. SWR is, I would say, one of the easiest. Mm-hmm. There are a few that are probably easier than that. AN is one of the more difficult ones. So I think maybe you have some insight knowledge that you have selected that particular one. Just because once we get into the medium-bodied profile, it becomes very an act of precision to differentiate the characteristic profiles. And so very easily notes can begin to cross if the balance between the components are not within their particular defined parameters. And so operating the still, even when the wash is coming in and sometimes may vary, compensating for those differences so as to get the particular profile that will give the specific node that that rum is characteristic of. Sometimes that can be a challenge. But I would have mentioned in my presentation that operator on the pot still of 35 years. We have many more like him. So I think that really helps us to get the art and craft right.
Okay. And then question says, Sharon says, do you dilute to a standard alcohol level when doing blending? For example, 40%. As a spirits judge, we are asked to dilute spirits to around 25 to 30%. So yes, tell us about this part of the process.
Okay, for quality control purposes, yes, I do 20% dilution when I'm on the panel. So I make sure that all the samples at the 20%. But I also check at bottle strength because it gives you a good indication of what the product will be like to the consumer. But for quality control purposes, yes, I do it at 20%.
Okay. I remember when I was there and was talking with Shaun about the DHE still, and I called somebody to come bring us a sample of that, and it came and they said, "Oh, by the way, this is 20%." And I was like, but it was still plenty strong. There was no doubt about that. So, there's another question here about the obscuration. I know Shaun and you and I have talked about this. Basically, it deals with like the obscuration, like the enthusiasts are doing, the hydrometers, and they're doing estimated sugar levels and stuff like that. Is there, if I remember correctly, you were talking about how there are other ways that you can get obscuration beyond just putting sugar in something. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, they're just direct analytical methods to measure sugar content and sugar by component, whether glucose, fructose, sucrose, and the addition of those. And that for us is the more reliable method because relying on obscuration assumes that all dissolved components are sugar, and of course it's not. Rums that are aged for as long and as aggressively in the tropical climates as ours will have a significant component of non-sugar dissolved components. And so for us, the direct measure gives the true value. We have found that if I were to give a ballpark, roughly about 40% of the total obscuration might result just because of residual sugars. And so for us, the direct analytical method, and we have the instrumentation to do so, those are a lot more accurate.
Right. So you say just 40% of the obscuration is actually attributable to sugar. So what are some of the things the remaining 60, what could those be? Like wood extracts or what are we talking about?
Absolutely. Wood extracts, so vanillins and so on. In my office, I still keep a couple of glasses of some of the older rums. And I do so because the first time I kept one for, I'm ashamed to admit, a couple of months without, disposing of it. And it was purely by accident. And I discovered that all of the alcohol by that time had evaporated, but it was still a significant amount of those dissolved extracts that are still present. So that alone tells you. Now, this was, of course, a clear rum to start. Well, not clear, it's transparent, but of course it's colored. But by the point where all of the alcohol evaporated, all of those things, those solids settle out. So it gives you a sense of the immense amount of those dissolved solids that are present.
Right.
Sugar.
Okay. And then I think one last question here is Ian Burrell asked, besides Sharon and Shaun, who are the stars behind the rums at DDL?
All right. So I did mention I'm the chief production officer for DDL, and that means, like Will said, it's beyond rum. It's the juices and beverages and so on. Our distillery operations manager, who has worked with me since 2012, and so now 9 years, and he started with the company for several years prior to that. Started in the quality control system, and was sponsored by the company to study at the University of Guyana in chemistry. So we have a number of persons who ensure the pipeline is filled. It's no different from my own experience with George Robinson, the late George Robinson, when I joined. So we are always serious about that continuity. And Sharon, of course, has the same on her end.
Great. So I think with I think one more may have come in. Is one last question, I think, from Paula Gallant. Says, would you or have you ever redistilled a spirit, aged or not? What is the effect as opposed to just mash fermentation? What would happen or be the results? Redistilled a spirit. I'm trying to think, aged or not. I'm not. Yeah, now that I look at it, I'm not sure I understand that one.
There is something that we call redistilled spirit,
right?
And so yes, but that is a very seldom practice.
Okay.
So it by no means forms a core of what we do here at DDL.
Right.
But if we have the capacity to do so, if desired, required.
Right. Right. And I guess one last question for myself. Sort of off topic, but can you tell us a little bit about the high ester rum you make? I know the rum geeks love this stuff.
Yes. Well, it's one of those that we have kept close to our chest, for the longest while. I know that the word has gotten out. We do have a high ester. So our particular fermentation lasts for weeks or months, depending on how rich we want it to get. And when we are ready to distill, for a number of weeks prior, we then spike the process with acetic acid that is able to then give a very particular note of ethyl acetate. So the difference with our high ester as opposed to others is that it is it is predominantly ethyl acetate, and the levels are much higher than you might see elsewhere, as many as 4 or 5 times higher. So at the end of that fermentation process, once we distill it over, we bring it back down to about 2,000 parts per million, and we then utilize.
And I assume this is one of the many tools in Sharon's toolbox that she has to use in creating rums.
Yeah, so I do have quite a variety, as you said.
Yeah.
Over 24. So yeah, I'm excited when I'm doing the blending. As I said, I'm privileged to have that wide number of rums. A lot of distilleries do not have that privilege.
Right, for sure. Okay, so we are just about out of time here. I want to thank you both so much for appearing on this. This has been a joy for me to work with you in creating this presentation. It seems like from the comments that people are loving the information we've shared, and thank you for sharing that knowledge with us. Anything you'd like to share before we have Will sign us off?
Well, I hope that persons can drink up their rum so that they don't,
yes,
lose any.
Yes.
And for me, well, you would have had a chance to taste the 3 and to see how different they are, and not just different, but also elevated in their own way. So if you're a cigar kind of person, or you enjoy your truffles, there's certainly one of our El Dorado rum expressions that can pair very well with that experience. And so we always encourage you to drink responsibly, but certainly enjoy. And this is what we're here for, to support your guilty pleasure.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, both. And Will, anything you want to say before we sign off?
No, just want to echo everything Matt said. Thank you, Sharon and Shaun, for sharing your knowledge. Matt, thank you for sharing yours as well. I know you dove into the history at the beginning. Tons of comments. I'm just looking over here at my other monitor. A lot of comments coming in. Several people saying this is the best rum presentation they'd seen in a while. So I think people really enjoyed it. And I put a little link underneath the stream if you're in attendance right now to the El Dorado website. So there's a lot more information on everything there. Also, earlier I put the link to Matt's Q&A with Shaun in the chat. But if you go to cocktailwonk.com, I believe it's the first article up there. Yeah, so go check that out for sure if you want to know more. But yeah, thanks so much, everyone. And Matt, I know you'll be back on Thursday.
Yeah, exactly, on Thursday. Yes.
Yeah.
We have Evan Brown coming up, so I'm excited for that.
Yeah, that'll be great. But Sharon, Shaun, thank you again so much, and thank you everyone for attending. And we'll see you again another time.
All right, take care, everybody. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Stay safe, everybody.